Hello there, my sleepy wanderers, and welcome back to another journey through the mists of ancient times. Tonight, we shall embark on a voyage across the gray-green waters of the North Atlantic, where the Vikings answered the call of the unknown seas and carved their names into the very fabric of history. Now, let us begin. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe deeply and let your mind drift across the centuries to a time when the sea was both home and highway, when wooden ships dared to kiss the edge of the world. In the gray dawning of the world, when mists still clung to the rocky shores of Scandinavia like the breath of sleeping giants, there lived a people who heard voices in the wind and saw pathways written in the stars. These were the Norse, the Vikings, and they possessed a relationship with the sea that transcended mere necessity. For them, the ocean was not simply water and wave, it was destiny itself, calling them forward into the unknown. Picture, if you will, a fjord in the early morning light. The water lies still as polished silver, reflecting the towering cliffs that rise on either side like the walls of the god's own hall. Mist curls across the surface, and in this mist, shapes begin to form. These are the longships, sleek, elegant vessels that seem almost alive, their dragon-headed prowls emerging from the fog like creatures from another realm. The Vikings believed that their ships possessed spirits, that each vessel carried within its wooden bones a fragment of the world tree Yggdrasil itself. When they laid their hands upon the smooth planks, they felt the pulse of something ancient and knowing. When they raised the sail and felt the wind catch, they heard whispers of where they must go, what they must seek, what destiny awaited them beyond the curved horizon. This was no mere superstition, no simple sailor's tale. This was the deep knowing that connected the Norse people to the very rhythms of existence, the understanding that some are called to wander, some are meant to discover, and some must brave the unknown so that the world itself might grow larger. The craft of creation. Let us pause here in this misty morning and consider the miracle of the longship itself. For these vessels were not simply built, they were brought into being through a sacred process that merged craftsmanship with magic, practical knowledge with spiritual understanding. Deep in the forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the shipwrights would walk among the ancient oaks, speaking to them in whispered tones, asking permission before the first cut was made. They knew which trees had grown strong and true, which had been kissed by lightning and thereby blessed by Thor himself, which held within their rings the memory of 100 winters and the promise of journeys yet to come. The selection of wood was a ritual that could take months. The master shipwright, often a man whose father and grandfather had built ships before him, would place his weathered hand against the bark and close his eyes. He listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper, for the tree's consent. Only when he felt the wood was willing would he mark it for harvest. The felling itself took place during specific phases of the moon, at times when the sap ran slow and the wood would be strongest. As each tree fell, offerings were made to the landvatter, the land spirits who guarded these ancient groves. Mead was poured upon the roots, words of gratitude were spoken into the wind, and promises were made that the tree's sacrifice would be honored through craftsmanship of the highest order. Back in the shipyard, the transformation began. Using techniques passed down through generations, the shipwrights would split the oak along its natural grain, creating planks that maintained the wood's inherent strength. Each plank was shaped by hand, tapered and curved with an understanding of how water moves, how wind pushes, how the sea itself breathes and shifts beneath a vessel's keel. The overlapping construction, what we now call clinker building, was a masterwork of flexibility and strength. Each plank overlapped the one below it, riveted together with iron nails that had been blessed in the forge, their creation accompanied by songs older than memory. This technique allowed the ship to flex with the waves rather than fight against them, to move with the sea's rhythm like a dancer, following music only she can hear. And then came the carving of the prow, the dragon head or serpent form that would lead the ship through dangerous waters. This was no mere decoration. The Vikings believed these figureheads held protective power, that they could frighten away the hostile spirits of unknown seas and guide the vessel through fog and storm. The carver would often fast for days before beginning this work, entering a trance-like state where his hands moved with a wisdom beyond conscious thought, revealing the spirit that had always lived. Within the wood, waiting to emerge, Njordr's children, born to the sea. The Vikings understood themselves to be children of Njordr, the Vanir god of the sea, wind, and wealth. In their cosmology, Njordr dwelt in Noatun, the ship enclosure, and it was he who granted safe passage across the waves, who filled nets with fish, who whispered to the wind to guide their sails to distant shores. Before any significant voyage, the ship's captain would make offerings to Njordr. At the water's edge, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and rose, he would pour meat into the sea and speak words of respect and petition. The offerings were not mere ritual, they were relationship, a conversation between human ambition and divine power, an acknowledgement that the sea's favor must be earned, never assumed. The Vikings also honored Ran, the goddess of the sea, though she was a more dangerous and capricious deity. Ran dwelt in the depths with her 9 daughters, the waves themselves, and she was known to drag sailors down to her underwater hall. Yet even Ran could be appeased. Vikings often carried gold when they sailed, not for trade alone, but as potential payment to the sea goddess should she come to claim them. To drown with gold was to arrive in Ran's hall as a guest rather than a prisoner. These beliefs shaped every aspect of Viking seafaring. The sea was never merely water to be crossed. It was a living realm filled with powers both benevolent and terrible, a threshold between the known world and the mysteries that lay beyond. To sail was to enter into relationship with forces greater than oneself, to accept that survival depended not just on skill and strength, but on maintaining right relationship with the gods who governed wind and wave. I'm curious about your own relationship with the sea, dear listener. Does the ocean call to you, or does it inspire a different feeling altogether? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing how these ancient stories resonate with modern souls. The navigation of stars and ravens. How did the Vikings find their way across vast stretches of open ocean, you might wonder, in an age before compass or chart? The answer lies in a combination of careful observation, inherited wisdom, and what we might call a form of sacred navigation, a way of reading the world that merged practical skill with something approaching mystical knowing. The Vikings were masters of observation. They read the color of the water to know what lay beneath. They watched the patterns of waves to understand hidden currents and approaching weather. They noted the behavior of seabirds, knowing that certain species never ventured far from land, while others could lead them to fishing grounds or indicate the direction of distant shores. They possessed a deep knowledge of the stars. On clear nights, they navigated by the North Star, that fixed point around which the heavens wheel. They knew the paths of constellations across the seasons, understanding that stars rise and set at different points on the horizon throughout the year, and this knowledge served as a celestial map more reliable than anything drawn on vellum. But what of cloudy nights, when the stars hid themselves behind veils of gray? Here, legend speaks of the sunstone, a mysterious crystal that could locate the sun even through thick cloud cover. Modern researchers believe this may have been a form of calcite or cordierite, minerals that can detect polarized light and thereby indicate the sun's position even when it cannot be directly seen. Whether such stones were truly used remains debated, but the possibility that Viking navigators possessed this almost magical tool adds another layer of wonder to their seafaring achievements. And then there were the ravens. Like Odin himself, who sent his ravens Hugin and Munin across the world to gather knowledge, Viking explorers sometimes carried ravens aboard their ships. When they believed land might be near but could not see it, they would release a raven. The bird would circle high above the ship, and if it spotted land, it would fly toward it, providing the sailors with a heading to follow. If the raven saw no land, it would return to the ship, the only stable point in an endless expanse of sea. This practice, recorded in the sagas, speaks to the Vikings' understanding of the natural world as full of teachers and guides. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, dominating it through technology, but rather as participants in a larger web of life, learning from birds and stones and stars how to find their way through an uncertain world. The Saga of the Westfarers. Let us now turn our attention to one of history's most remarkable journeys, the Viking discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America itself. This was no sudden conquest, no single dramatic voyage, but rather a gradual pushing westward across the North Atlantic, driven by necessity, curiosity, and the restless Viking spirit that could never quite settle for what was already known. In the late 9th century, as political consolidation in Norway made life difficult for certain chieftains who valued their independence, many Norse families began to look westward for new opportunities. They had heard tales of islands to the west, lands glimpsed by ships blown off course, rumors carried by traders and explorers. The sea, ever mysterious, was revealing new possibilities. Iceland was already known. Irish monks had established small hermitages there, seeking solitude in that harsh and beautiful land. But beginning around 874 CE, Norwegian families began arriving in significant numbers, bringing their language, laws, and gods to this island of fire and ice. They established farms in the valleys, raised cattle and sheep, and created a society that would produce some of the greatest literary works of the medieval world, the Icelandic. Sagas that preserve so much of what we know about Viking culture and mythology. Life in Iceland was hard but free. The settlers created the Althing, one of the world's oldest surviving parliaments, where free men gathered each summer to settle disputes and create laws. In this new land, away from the kings and established hierarchies of Norway, they built a society according to their own values, a society where a man's worth was measured by his reputation, his wisdom, and his willingness to stand by his word. But even Iceland eventually grew crowded, at least by Viking standards. Some men possessed that particular restlessness that no settlement could satisfy, that yearning for what lay beyond the next horizon. Among these was Eric the Red, a man whose temperament matched his name, fiery, stubborn, and prone to conflicts that repeatedly forced him to seek new beginnings. Exiled from Iceland for manslaughter around 982 CE, Eric sailed west into waters that were more legend than geography. He found a land massive and forbidding, a place of towering glaciers and frozen coasts. But along the southwestern shore, he discovered fjords where grass grew green in the short summer, where sheep could graze and settlements might survive. Whether from optimism or marketing genius, he named this harsh land Greenland, a name that would attract other colonists seeking fresh starts. Eric returned to Iceland with tales of opportunity, and soon ships were sailing west once more, carrying families and livestock, dreams and determination. The Greenland settlements endured for nearly 500 years, a remarkable achievement in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The colonists maintained their Norse identity, raised cattle, traded walrus ivory back to Europe, and built churches once they converted to Christianity. Yet always, they lived on the edge, dependent on supply ships from Iceland, and vulnerable to any shift in climate or circumstance. If you're enjoying this journey across the ancient seas, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find these stories, and it lets me know that these slow, contemplative explorations of history resonate with you. Vinland, the edge of legend. But the westward journeys didn't end with Greenland. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed even further into the unknown, following reports from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have seen unknown lands to the west while blown off course years earlier. What Leif discovered changed everything, though the Vikings themselves didn't quite realize it at the time. He found lands of forests and meadows, rivers teeming with salmon, and vines bearing grapes. Or so the sagas tell us. He named these places Helluland, Stone Slab Land, Markland, Forest Land, and Vinland, Wineland or Meadowland. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as legend, exaggeration, or misidentification. But in 1960, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Here was physical proof, Viking buildings, Norse artifacts, evidence of iron smelting. The Vikings had indeed reached North America 500 years before Columbus, establishing at least temporary settlements on these distant shores. Imagine the wonder of those first Vikings stepping onto North American soil. They were further from home than any Norse people had ever ventured, standing on a continent whose vastness they couldn't begin to comprehend. The forests must have seemed endless after the treeless landscapes of Iceland and Greenland. The native peoples they encountered, whom they called Skraelings, were unlike anyone they had known, speaking languages no Norseman could understand, possessing technologies and customs that seemed strange and sometimes frightening. The sagas tell us that conflicts arose between the Norse settlers and the indigenous peoples. The Vikings were outnumbered, far from reinforcements, and unable to establish the supply lines necessary for permanent settlement. After a few years, perhaps a decade at most, they abandoned Vinland, returning to Greenland with tales of a rich land that nonetheless could not be held. Yet the achievement remains staggering. With nothing but their longships, their knowledge of sea and sky, and their extraordinary courage, the Vikings crossed the North Atlantic and discovered a new world. They proved that the ocean, vast as it was, could not contain the human hunger for knowledge, for new horizons, for the next adventure waiting just beyond the visible edge of things. The spiritual journey. But these physical journeys across the sea were always more than mere geographic exploration. For the Vikings, every voyage was also a spiritual journey, a testing of fate, a conversation with destiny itself. The Norse concept of wired, often translated as fate, but more accurately understood as the accumulated weight of all past actions creating present circumstances, shaped how Vikings understood their lives and journeys. Your weird was not predetermined destiny so much as the current created by all that had come before, carrying you towards certain possibilities while closing off others. When a Viking captain stood at the prow of his ship, watching the unknown horizon, he wasn't simply wondering what lands he might find. He was contemplating his wired, asking himself what fate had woven for him, what destiny was pulling him forward across these gray-green waters. The journey itself was a way of discovering who he truly was, what the Norns had woven into his thread of life. This is why reputation mattered so intensely to the Vikings. Your fame, your reputation after death, was a kind of immortality, the only immortality they truly believed in before the coming of Christianity. To die bravely exploring unknown seas, to have your name remembered in saga and song, was to achieve something that death itself could not erase. You would live on in the minds and mouths of future generations, your deeds becoming part of the great story that gave meaning to existence. Every significant journey, therefore, carried existential weight. When Vikings set sail for unknown waters, they weren't just risking death, they were crafting the story of who they were, creating the reputation that would survive them. This is why the sagas spend so much time on voyages and explorations, why they remember not just where people went, but how they conducted themselves, what courage they showed, what cleverness they employed when faced with the unexpected. The sea voyage became a metaphor for life itself, a journey from known shores into mystery, dependent on skill and luck in equal measure, certain to end but uncertain as to when and how. To sail was to live deliberately, to embrace rather than flee from the fundamental uncertainty of existence. The long winter night. Not all voyages ended in triumph. The North Atlantic is a graveyard of ships and dreams, and the Vikings knew this intimately. For every successful journey to Iceland or Greenland, for every safe return from a trading voyage to Byzantium, there were ships that simply vanished, swallowed by storm or fog, their crews lost to the cold depths where Ran waits with her nets of drowned sailors. The sagas sometimes speak of ships that departed and were never seen again, of men who sailed into the morning mist and passed out of the world of the living into the realm of story and speculation. These disappearances were not regarded as mere accidents, but as fates working, as the Norns cutting threads that had reached their appointed length. Families waiting on shore would watch the sea for returning sails, and as days turned to weeks, weeks to months, hope would gradually transform into grief, though often grief without certainty. Not knowing was its own particular torment, a loss that could never fully be mourned because it could never be fully confirmed. Perhaps the ship had been driven far off course and would eventually return. Perhaps the crew had been enslaved in distant lands and might someday find their way home. Perhaps they had discovered new territories and chosen to settle there, beyond all communication. This uncertainty bred a particular kind of resilience in Viking families. They learned to live with not knowing, to accept that the sea might claim their loved ones without explanation or return. They developed funeral practices for those lost at sea, memorial stones carved with runes, funeral feasts held without bodies, stories told to preserve the memory of those who had become part of the ocean's mystery. There's something profound in this acceptance of loss without closure, this ability to honor those who vanished into the unknown. It speaks to a culture that understood the fundamental precariousness of existence, that knew safety was always provisional, that accepted the sea's power to take without asking permission. The transformation, Christianity, and the changing sea. As the Viking Age progressed, profound changes swept through Norse society. The conversion to Christianity, occurring gradually across Scandinavia from the 10th through 12th centuries, fundamentally altered how Vikings understood themselves and their relationship with the sea. The old gods, Njörður and Ran, Thor and Odin, gradually receded into the background, replaced by the Christian God and his saints. Sailors who once poured offerings to sea gods now prayed to Saint Nicholas, patron saint of sailors, or to Saint Brendan, legendary navigator of Christian tradition. The dragon-headed prows that once warded off hostile spirits were removed or replaced with Christian crosses. Yet the transformation was never complete or simple. Iceland, for instance, officially adopted Christianity around the year 1000 CE, but private worship of the old gods was still permitted. Many families maintained altars to both Christ and Thor, hedging their spiritual bets, unable to fully abandon the gods who had carried them across the seas for so many generations. The sagas themselves preserve this tension. Written down in Christian Iceland during the 12th and 13th centuries, they tell stories of pagan ancestors with a mixture of admiration and moral ambivalence. The saga writers honored the courage and achievement of their forebears, while also noting their paganism as a limitation, a darkness from which Christianity had rescued them. But something was lost in this transformation, the intimate relationship with the sea as a divine realm, the sense of sailing as spiritual conversation with cosmic forces, gradually faded. The ocean became more prosaic, more purely physical, still dangerous, still demanding respect, but no longer quite so alive with presences and personalities. The world, in a sense, became less enchanted. This process mirrors changes happening across medieval Europe, the slow replacement of animistic, polytheistic worldviews with monotheistic ones, the gradual abstraction of the sacred away from direct presence in the natural world. Whether this represented progress or loss, or both simultaneously, remains a question worth contemplating. The legacy in our blood. The Viking Age traditionally ended around 1066 CE with the failed invasion of England by Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king. The era of raiding and exploration gradually gave way to a period of consolidation, state formation, and integration into the broader currents of European medieval society. The longships were beached, the dragon prows carved away, the old paths across the sea traveled now by merchants more than warriors. Yet the legacy persisted in ways both obvious and subtle. The Norse language left its mark across Northern Europe. In English, we still count with Norse-derived numbers, still use hundreds of words that sailed across the North Sea in Viking ships. Place names from Dublin to Normandy preserve Norse linguistic patterns, ghosts of occupation and settlement. More profoundly, the Viking expansion shaped the genetic and cultural landscape of vast territories. Iceland's population descends almost entirely from Norwegian settlers and the Irish slaves and wives they brought with them. Northern England, Scotland, and Ireland all carry significant Norse genetic heritage. The Normans who conquered England in 1066 were themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in France 2 centuries earlier, carrying Norse cultural patterns, even after adopting French language and customs. But perhaps the deepest legacy is more spiritual, more philosophical. The Viking embrace of exploration, the willingness to sail beyond the known horizon, the courage to face uncertainty. These became woven into the cultural DNA of Northern European societies. The restlessness that drove Vikings across the Atlantic found later expression in the age of exploration, in the settlement of the Americas, in the human pattern of always pushing boundaries, always seeking what lies beyond. Whether this restlessness is ultimately positive or destructive remains debatable. The same impulse that drove magnificent voyages of discovery also drove conquest, displacement, and cultural destruction. The courage to explore can't be easily separated from the arrogance to claim, to take, to rewrite existing human geographies according to one's own desires and needs. Yet there's something in us, perhaps particularly in those of Northern European descent, but really in all humans, that responds to these stories of voyages into the unknown. We feel the call of distant horizons. We understand, even in our modern, mapped and GPS-tracked world, the romance of discovery, the allure of seeing what lies beyond our current boundaries. I wonder, dear listener, if you feel that call, does something in you yearn to explore, to venture beyond the familiar, to discover what waits in territories you've never seen? Or does the comfort of home and the known speak more deeply to your spirit? There's no wrong answer. The Vikings themselves always had those who sailed and those who tended the farms, and both were necessary, both were honored. Share your thoughts in the comments below. The eternal return. Let us bring our journey to a close by returning to where we began, to that misty morning in the fjord, where a longship emerges from the fog like a dream taking physical form. The Vikings are gone now, at least as a distinct people living according to their particular customs and beliefs. The language has evolved into modern Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic. The gods have been replaced, the ships have rotted away, the graves have been excavated and their contents placed in museums. Yet, something persists. On cold mornings when mist lies heavy on the water, when the sun breaks through in shafts of pearl-colored light, when the wind carries salt and the cries of seabirds. In these moments, it's not difficult to imagine that we're catching a glimpse of what those ancient sailors saw, feeling what they felt, hearing the same call that drew them westward across waters they feared and loved in equal measure. The sea remains mysterious despite all our modern knowledge of currents and temperatures, despite satellite imagery and weather forecasting. It still claims ships and sailors, still shifts between moods of gentle beauty and murderous fury, still calls to those who hear in its waves something more than water, some invitation to venture beyond safety, to test oneself against the unknown, to discover what you're truly made of when everything familiar falls away behind the stern of your boat. Perhaps this is the deepest truth about the Vikings and their relationship with the sea. They understood that some callings must be answered, even when, especially when, the destination is uncertain and the journey dangerous. They knew that safety, while pleasant, is not the highest value. That to be fully alive requires accepting risk, embracing uncertainty, sailing toward horizons that might or might not exist, trusting in skill and luck and the favor of whatever powers govern wind and wave. As you drift toward sleep tonight, I invite you to imagine yourself standing at the prow of a longship, feeling the deck move beneath your feet with the rhythm of the sea, watching the spray catch sunlight and shatter into temporary rainbows, hearing the creak of wood and the snap of the sail above you. You're voyaging toward an unknown destination, carried forward by wind and current and something harder to name, that restless human hunger for discovery, that courage to face what you don't yet understand, that willingness to trust that the journey itself matters as much as any destination. The Vikings made their voyages with wooden ships and woolen sails, with courage and navigational wisdom, passed down through generations. They had no engines to power them through calm waters, no radios to call for help, no GPS to tell them precisely where they were. They had only their skills, their courage, their relationship with forces larger than themselves, and their willingness to embrace the fundamental uncertainty of existence. What voyages await you in your own life? What horizons are you being called to explore? What safe harbors might you need to leave behind? What courage will you need to gather as you face your own unmapped waters? These are not questions I can answer for you, dear listener. But perhaps in contemplating the Vikings and their magnificent ships, their daring journeys, and their hard-won wisdom, you'll find some guidance for your own voyages through life's uncertain seas. Thank you for joining me on this journey across the North Atlantic and through the centuries. If this exploration has brought you some measure of peace, wonder, or contemplation, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others who might appreciate these slow, thoughtful wanderings through history and mythology. I'm deeply grateful for this community we're building together, a community of people who find value in slowing down, in contemplating the deep patterns of human existence, in letting stories from the distant past speak to our present lives. Your support through Patreon helps make these productions possible, and your comments and reflections always teach me something new. Until our next journey together, may you find your own true north. May favorable winds fill your sails, and may you have the courage to voyage toward whatever horizons call to you, knowing that the journey itself, uncertain as it must be, is what makes us fully, courageously, beautifully human. Sleep well, dear wanderer. The sea is always waiting, and tomorrow brings new tides, new winds, new possibilities for those brave enough to leave the shore behind. In the gray dawning of the world, when mists still clung to the rocky shores of Scandinavia like the breath of sleeping giants, there lived a people who heard voices in the wind and saw pathways written in the stars. These were the Norse, the Vikings, and they possessed a relationship with the sea that transcended mere necessity. For them, the ocean was not simply water and wave. It was destiny itself, calling them forward into the unknown. Picture, if you will, a fjord in the early morning light. The water lies still as polished silver, reflecting the towering cliffs that rise on either side like the walls of the god's own hall. Mist curls across the surface, and in this mist, shapes begin to form. These are the longships, sleek, elegant vessels that seem almost alive, their dragon-headed prowls emerging from the fog like creatures from another realm. The Vikings believed that their ships possessed spirits, that each vessel carried within its wooden bones a fragment of the world tree Yggdrasil itself. When they laid their hands upon the smooth planks, they felt the pulse of something ancient and knowing. When they raised the sail and felt the wind catch, they heard whispers of where they must go, what they must seek, what destiny awaited them beyond the curved horizon. This was no mere superstition, no simple sailor's tale. This was the deep knowing that connected the Norse people to the very rhythms of existence, the understanding that some are called to wander, some are meant to discover, and some must brave the unknown so that the world itself might grow larger. The sound of water against the hull was a language the Vikings understood fluently. Each lap and splash, each pattern of waves spoke of weather approaching or currents shifting. Old sailors could tell you stories of how they learned to sleep aboard ships, rocked by the sea's rhythm, how that rocking became more familiar than the stillness of land, how returning home always felt slightly wrong after months at sea because the ground refused to move beneath their feet. The craft of creation. Let us pause here, in this misty morning, and consider the miracle of the longship itself. For these vessels were not simply built, they were brought into being through a sacred process that merged craftsmanship with magic, practical knowledge with spiritual understanding. Deep in the forests of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the shipwrights would walk among the ancient oaks, speaking to them in whispered tones, asking permission before the first cut was made. They knew which trees had grown strong and true, which had been kissed by lightning and thereby blessed by Thor himself, which held within their rings the memory of 100 winters and the promise of journeys yet to come. The selection of wood was a ritual that could take months. The master shipwright, often a man whose father and grandfather had built ships before him, would place his weathered hand against the bark and close his eyes. He listened, not with his ears, but with something deeper, for the tree's consent. Only when he felt the wood was willing would he mark it for harvest. The felling itself took place during specific phases of the moon, at times when the sap ran slow and the wood would be strongest. As each tree fell, offerings were made to the Landvetter, the land spirits who guarded these ancient groves. Mead was poured upon the roots, words of gratitude were spoken into the wind, and promises were made that the tree's sacrifice would be honored through craftsmanship of the highest order. Back in the shipyard, the transformation began. Using techniques passed down through generations, the shipwrights would split the oak along its natural grain, creating planks that maintained the wood's inherent strength. Each plank was shaped by hand, tapered and curved with an understanding of how water moves, how wind pushes, how the sea itself breathes and shifts beneath a vessel's keel. The tools themselves were objects of reverence. A master shipwright's axe might be generations old, its handle worn smooth by the hands of father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him. The blade would be resharpened countless times, growing thinner with each passing year, but never discarded. These tools carried the skill of all who had wielded them, and young apprentices learned that to hold such a tool was to channel the wisdom of ancestors, to become part of a lineage stretching back into the mists of time. The overlapping construction, what we now call clinker building, was a masterwork of flexibility and strength. Each plank overlapped the one below it, riveted together with iron nails that had been blessed in the forge, their creation accompanied by songs older than memory. This technique allowed the ship to flex with the waves rather than fight against them, to move with the sea's rhythm like a dancer following music only she can hear. The iron nails themselves were minor miracles. Each one was forged individually, heated and hammered into shape while the smith sang or chanted. The Vikings believed that iron held within it the power to ward off evil spirits, and these nails, driven through oak planks blessed by the landvetir, created a vessel that was as much magical object as physical craft. The nails were often made from bog iron or harvested from the beds of marshes and streams, metal that had spent centuries forming in the meeting place of earth and water, appropriate material for ships that would sail the boundary between land and sea. The caulking between planks was typically animal hair, often from cattle or sheep, mixed with tar made from pine trees. This mixture was pressed into the gaps, creating a seal that was both flexible and waterproof. The tar had its own protective qualities. Its strong scent was believed to repel malevolent sea spirits, and its dark color absorbed the sun's warmth, helping to keep the ship slightly warmer in the frigid northern waters. And then came the carving of the prow, the dragon head or serpent form that would lead the ship through dangerous waters. This was no mere decoration. The Vikings believed these figureheads held protective power, that they could frighten away the hostile spirits of unknown seas and guide the vessel through fog and storm. The carver would often fast for days before beginning this work, entering a trance-like state where his hands moved with a wisdom beyond conscious thought, revealing the spirit that had always lived within the wood, waiting to emerge. The dragon's eyes were particularly important. They needed to see into the realms beyond normal sight to perceive dangers that human eyes might miss. Sometimes precious materials were inlaid into these eyes. Amber, which the Norse associated with the tears of Freya and believed held power to see truth, or glass, rare and valuable, which could capture light in ways that seemed almost alive. The dragon's mouth was always open, ready to roar defiance at whatever might threaten the ship and its crew. The mast was another crucial element, often made from a single tall pine tree. This tree would be selected with even greater care than the oak used for the hull, for the mast had to be strong enough to support the sail, yet flexible enough to bend in high winds without snapping. The mast stepped into a massive oak block called the keelson, which distributed the mast's weight across several of the ship's ribs. This joint, where vertical met horizontal, where the reaching skyward mast met the water-cutting keel, was seen as particularly sacred, a meeting point of different realms. The sail itself was woven from wool, a months-long project typically undertaken by the women of the household. Sheep would be selected for the finest wool, shorn in spring when their winter coats were thickest. The wool would be cleaned, carded, spun into yarn, and then woven on vertical looms into panels that would be stitched together to create the sail. A typical sail might measure 30 feet by 30 feet, requiring hundreds of hours of labor from multiple women working together. But the weaving was not merely practical work. It was accompanied by songs, by chants, by the invoking of blessings. The women knew that the sail they created would carry their husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers across dangerous seas. They wove protection into every thread, sang safety into every knot. Some sails were decorated with symbols, Thor's hammer perhaps, or serpents and dragons, or geometric patterns that held meaning we can now only guess at. These decorations were not merely ornamental. They were prayers made visible, hopes woven into fabric, love transformed into protection. The wool was often treated with a mixture of fat and ochre, which gave it a reddish-brown color and helped waterproof it. When such a sail was raised, wet with rain or sea spray, and the sun broke through clouds behind it, it would glow like it was lit from within, like a living thing, like the sail itself had caught fire with purpose and determination. Njordr's children, born to the sea. The Vikings understood themselves to be children of Njordr, the Vanir god of the sea, wind, and wealth. In their cosmology, Njordr dwelt in Noatun, the ship enclosure, and it was he who granted safe passage across the waves, who filled nets with fish, who whispered to the wind to guide their sails to distant shores. Before any significant voyage, the ship's captain would make offerings to Njordr. At the water's edge, as dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and rose, he would pour mead into the sea and speak words of respect and petition. The offerings were not mere ritual. They were relationship, a conversation between human ambition and divine power, an acknowledgement that the sea's favor must be earned, never assumed. The ritual of launching a new ship was particularly elaborate. The vessel would be dragged down to the water on logs, with the entire community helping to move it. As it touched the sea for the first time, animals would be sacrificed, sometimes a horse, an animal sacred to Njordr, or cattle or sheep. The blood would be sprinkled on the prow and stern, christening the ship with life force, creating a bond between the vessel and the powers that governed its element. A ship that had been properly blessed and had proven itself on multiple voyages was considered lucky, possessed of good fortune that made it and its crew more likely to survive storms and encounters with hostile forces. Sailors would request positions on lucky ships, willing to accept lower shares of any profits in exchange for the increased likelihood of returning home alive. Conversely, unlucky ships, those that had lost crew members, that had foundered and barely been saved, that had suffered unusual difficulties, might be avoided or might be ritually purified through additional sacrifices and blessings. The Vikings also honored Ran, the goddess of the sea, though she was a more dangerous and capricious deity. Ran dwelt in the depths with her 9 daughters, the waves themselves, and she was known to drag sailors down to her underwater hall. Yet, even Ran could be appeased. Vikings often carried gold when they sailed, not for trade alone, but as potential payment to the sea goddess should she come to claim them. To drown with gold was to arrive in Ran's hall as a guest rather than a prisoner, to be welcomed rather than enslaved. There were specific rituals for different types of voyages. A trading expedition required different blessings than a raid, which differed from an exploration voyage. The words spoken, the offerings made, the gods invoked, all these varied depending on the journey's purpose. A trader might emphasize requests for fair winds and profitable exchanges, invoking not just Njordr but also Freyr, god of fertility and prosperity. A raiding party might invoke Thor for strength and Odin for cunning and victory. An exploration voyage might call upon Heimdallr, the far-seeing god who stood at the boundaries of the known world. These beliefs shaped every aspect of Viking seafaring. The sea was never merely water to be crossed. It was a living realm, filled with powers both benevolent and terrible, a threshold between the known world and the mysteries that lay beyond. To sail was to enter into relationship with forces greater than oneself, to accept that survival depended not just on skill and strength, but on maintaining right relationship with the gods who governed wind and wave. The sea had moods that sailors learned to read. There were days when it lay calm as a mirror, reflecting clouds with such perfection that it seemed you could fall upward into the sky. On such days, rowing was necessary, and the crew would settle into the rhythm of oars cutting water, the steady pull and return, hour after hour. This was meditative work, boring and exhausting by turns, but it built the cohesion of the crew, synchronized their movements, made them into a single organism moving across the water. Then there were days when the sea grew playful, choppy with whitecaps, the ship rising and falling in a motion that could be exhilarating or nauseating depending on one's constitution. The wind would be variable on such days, requiring constant adjustment of the sail, constant attention to course and trim. These were days that tested seamanship, that separated the naturally gifted sailors from those who would never quite develop the feel for wind and wave. And there were the days of storm, when the sea revealed its true power. The waves would build until they towered above the ship, mountains of gray-green water topped with foam that flew horizontal in the shrieking wind. On such days, survival required every bit of skill and luck the crew possessed. The sail would be reefed or struck entirely, and the ship would run before the wind, riding up one wave and sliding down the next, spray flying, timber groaning, every man knowing that the next wave might be the one that rolled them, that filled the ship, that sent them down to Ran's cold embrace. Yet even in these moments of terror, there was a strange exhilaration. This was what they had been born for, what all the preparation had been leading toward, this test, this moment of facing the sea's fury and either mastering it or being mastered by it. Those who survived such storms formed bonds with their shipmates that transcended normal friendship. They had looked death in the face together and lived to tell of it. They had measured themselves against the ultimate challenge and not been found wanting. I'm curious about your own relationship with the sea, dear listener. Does the ocean call to you, or does it inspire a different feeling altogether? Share your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing how these ancient stories resonate with modern souls. Life aboard the longship. Let us step aboard now and experience what daily life was like for Viking sailors on a long voyage. The longship, for all its elegance and seaworthiness, was not comfortable by modern standards. There were no cabins, no beds, no shelter beyond what could be improvised with awnings or tents rigged from spare sail material. The crew would sleep on the deck or on their sea chests, wrapped in woolen cloaks and skin sleeping bags. On cold nights, men would huddle together for warmth, their body heat shared beneath layers of wool and leather. The motion of the ship, the constant sound of waves and wind, the smell of tar and salt and unwashed men. These became so familiar that returning to land felt strange, the stillness of a house uncomfortable after months of constant movement. Food aboard ship was simple and grew increasingly monotonous as voyages lengthened. The staples were dried fish, dried meat, hard bread, butter, and cheese, all things that could keep for weeks or months without spoiling. Fresh water was carried in barrels and carefully rationed, with each man receiving his measured share daily. On longer voyages, the water would grow stale and develop a taste, but it remained drinkable long after it ceased being pleasant. When possible, the crew would make landfall each evening, beaching the ship and making camp on shore. This allowed them to light fires, cook hot meals, and sleep on solid ground. Fresh water could be collected, and if they were lucky, fish caught or game hunted to supplement their stores. These evening camps were times of storytelling, of songs, of strengthening the bonds that held the crew together. But many voyages required days or even weeks at sea without touching land. On these open ocean passages, life became an endurance test. The crew would divide into watches, with some men always alert while others slept. The ship required constant attention. The sail needed trimming as the wind shifted. The course needed checking against sun or stars. Water needed bailing from the bilge, where it inevitably seeped through the caulking. The helmsman, standing at the stern steering oar, held perhaps the most crucial position. The steering oar, called the styri, from which we get our word starboard, originally steerboard, was mounted on the right rear side of the ship. It required strength to control in rough seas and skill to sense how the ship was responding to wave and wind. A good helmsman could feel through the steering oar what the ship needed, could sense when to resist the sea's push and when to yield to it, when to turn into a wave and when to ride with it. The ship's captain, the steersman or helmsman, was typically also the ship's owner, the man who had commissioned its building or inherited it from his father. His authority was absolute at sea, but it was an authority earned through demonstrated competence. A captain who made poor decisions, who risked his crew unnecessarily, who failed to bring them home safely. Such a man would find it difficult to recruit crew for future voyages. Reputation was everything, and reputations were built through deeds, through successful voyages, through bringing men home wealthy and alive. The crew itself was a carefully balanced social unit. Some members might be the captain's kinsmen, brothers, sons, cousins, whose presence was both expected and advantageous. Blood ties created trust and obligation, reduced the chance of mutiny or betrayal. Others would be free men seeking adventure or profit, men with their own reputations to build or maintain. And some might be thralls, slaves, who rode but received no share of any profits, who served at their master's command. Yet even this hierarchy could become fluid at sea. The ocean didn't respect social distinctions. When the ship was in danger, every man worked regardless of status. A thrall who proved brave and skillful might earn his freedom. A free man who showed cowardice might be shunned, his reputation destroyed. The sea was a great leveler, respecting only competence and courage. Entertainment on long voyages came from stories and songs. The Norse had a rich tradition of oral poetry, and a man who could remember and recite the great tales, stories of gods and heroes, of past voyages and legendary battles, was valued on any ship. These stories served multiple purposes. They preserved cultural memory, passing down from generation to generation the wisdom and values of the Norse people. They entertained, helping long hours pass more quickly. And they reminded the crew of their place in a larger story, that they were part of a tradition of seafaring that stretched back into mythic time, that they were following in the wake of heroes. Some ships carried skalds, professional poets, whose gift for words was considered almost magical. A skald could compose verses on the spot, praising brave deeds or commemorating significant moments. A good skald could make a man immortal through poetry, could ensure that his name and deeds would be remembered long after death. This was power of the highest order in a culture where fame after death was the only immortality most believed in. Music also had its place. Simple instruments, bone flutes, skin drums, simple lyres could be brought aboard. The rhythm of rowing might be kept by drum or song, coordinating the crew's efforts. In the evening, around a beach fire, there might be dancing, a release of the tension and fear that came with days of open ocean sailing. But there were also long stretches of silence when men sat with their own thoughts, watching the horizon, contemplating their fate. The sea invited introspection. Without the distractions of daily life on land, without the constant demands of farm and family, men had time to think deeply, to wonder about their lives and choices, to face questions they might otherwise avoid. Many sailors spoke of visions seen at sea, of moments of clarity or insight that came only when surrounded by endless water, when the line between sea and sky blurred and the mind opened to possibilities it normally kept closed. The navigation of stars and ravens. How did the Vikings find their way across vast stretches of open ocean, you might wonder, in an age before compass or chart? The answer lies in a combination of careful observation, inherited wisdom, and what we might call a form of sacred navigation, a way of reading the world that merged practical skill with something approaching mystical knowing. The Vikings were masters of observation. They read the color of the water to know what lay beneath. Deep ocean appeared as dark blue or blue-black, while shallower waters over continental shelves showed lighter blues and greens. The sudden appearance of lighter water could indicate approaching land, warning of shoals or reefs. Water rich with plankton had a different quality than water in plankton-poor regions, and plankton attracted fish, which attracted seabirds, all information that could be woven together to build understanding of one's location. They watched the patterns of waves with intense attention. Waves in open ocean had a consistent character, regular swells that rolled on and on, products of distant weather systems, but waves near land became irregular, choppy, as the ocean floor changed depth, and the land itself created complex patterns of reflection and refraction. An experienced sailor could detect these changes long before land became visible, could feel in the ship's motion that solid ground lay somewhere ahead. They noted the behavior of seabirds with scholarly precision. Different species had different ranges, different behaviors. Gannets might be seen diving for fish far from land, but they returned to coastal cliffs to nest. Guillemots and puffins stayed closer to shore. The appearance of land birds, sparrows, thrushes, even ravens, indicated that land was near, perhaps just beyond the horizon. Birds also provided direction. In the morning, birds flying away from the ship were likely heading to land to feed, while in evening, birds flying toward the ship were returning to land to roost. The flight paths of migrating birds in spring and autumn provided additional navigational information. The Vikings knew that certain species flew along particular routes, and a ship that followed these aerial highways would be led toward known destinations. Swans flying northeast in spring were heading for Iceland and beyond. Geese had their own routes, crisscrossing the North Atlantic in predictable patterns that could be memorized and followed. They possessed a deep knowledge of the stars. On clear nights, they navigated by the North Star, that fixed point around which the heavens wheel. They knew the paths of constellations across the seasons, understanding that stars rise and set at different points on the horizon throughout the year. And this knowledge served as a celestial map more reliable than anything drawn on vellum. The Big Dipper, called by the Norse the wagon or wain, pointed always toward the North Star. This constellation never set in northern latitudes, remaining visible throughout the night as it slowly rotated around its fixed pivot point. By measuring the angle between the horizon and the North Star, sailors could determine their latitude, knowing how far north or south they had traveled. This wasn't precise in modern terms, but it was accurate enough to bring a ship to Iceland or Greenland or the northern coast of Europe. But what of cloudy nights when the stars hid themselves behind veils of gray? What of the long summer days in Arctic latitudes when the sun barely set, when twilight lasted for hours and stars never appeared? Here, legend speaks of the sunstone, a mysterious crystal that could locate the sun even through thick cloud cover. Modern researchers believe this may have been a form of calcite or cordierite, minerals that can detect polarized light and thereby indicate the sun's position even when it cannot be directly seen. When you hold certain crystals up to the sky and rotate them, they show different light properties depending on their orientation relative to the sun's position. Even on an overcast day, even when the sun's disk is completely hidden, these crystals respond to the polarized light scattered by the atmosphere, showing a subtle glow or change in opacity that points toward the hidden sun. Whether such stones were truly used remains debated among scholars. No Viking-era sunstone has been definitively identified, though a piece of calcite was found among the cargo of a 16th-century ship that sank off the Channel Islands. and its position on the ship and condition suggested it might have been used for navigation. The sagas make ambiguous references to stones used for wayfinding, but the details are frustratingly vague. Still, the possibility that Viking navigators possessed this almost magical tool adds another layer of wonder to their seafaring achievements. And then there were the ravens. Like Odin himself, who sent his ravens Hugin and Munin across the world to gather knowledge, Viking explorers sometimes carried ravens aboard their ships. These birds, sacred to Odin, were believed to possess wisdom and foresight beyond normal animal intelligence. When they believed land might be near but could not see it, they would release a raven. The bird would circle high above the ship, using its superior vantage point to scan the horizon in all directions. If it spotted land, it would fly toward it, providing the sailors with a heading to follow. If the raven saw no land, it would return to the ship, the only stable point in an endless expanse of sea, the only place offering food and water and the company of humans. This practice, recorded in the sagas, speaks to the Vikings' understanding of the natural world as full of teachers and guides. They did not see themselves as separate from nature, dominating it through technology, but rather as participants in a larger web of life, learning from birds and stones and stars how to find their way through an uncertain world. The Vikings also used a technique called latitude sailing. Once they knew the latitude of their destination, how far north it lay, they would sail north or south until they reached that latitude, then turn east or west and sail along that line until they reached their goal. This technique required only the ability to measure latitude, which could be done by observing the sun's height at noon or the North Star's angle at night. Crude instruments existed for making these measurements, simple marked boards, or even just noting the angle against parts of the ship or one's own body. Dead reckoning also played a crucial role. This was the practice of calculating one's position based on careful tracking of speed and direction. A sailor would estimate the ship's speed, perhaps by watching how quickly seaweed or debris passed the hull, or by timing how long it took a floating chip of wood dropped at the bow to reach the stern. This speed, multiplied by time sailed, gave distance traveled. Direction was maintained by sun or stars when visible, or by wind direction, wave direction, or even the flight of birds when celestial objects were hidden. All this information, speeds, times, directions, distances, would be held in memory. No written charts existed for most of the Viking Age. All navigational knowledge was oral, passed from master to apprentice through years of training and experience. A skilled navigator carried in his mind vast databases of information, the number of days sailing between various ports, the landmarks to watch for when approaching different coasts, the dangerous reefs and safe harbors, the prevailing winds and currents of different seasons. This oral tradition meant that navigational knowledge was precious and carefully guarded. A man who could reliably guide ships across open ocean was valuable, could command high payment for his services, could rise in status and wealth through his skill alone. Young men who wished to learn navigation would attach themselves to master navigators, watching and listening and gradually building their own mental maps of the northern seas. If you're enjoying this journey across the ancient seas, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps others find these stories, and it lets me know that these slow, contemplative explorations of history resonate with you. The trading voyages, silver roads across the sea. Not all Viking voyages were raids or explorations. Indeed, the majority of Norse seafaring was commercial, trading voyages that connected Scandinavia with the far-flung markets of medieval Europe, Asia, and even Africa. The Vikings were merchants as much as warriors, and their ships carried not just weapons but goods for trade. From the north came furs, beaver, marten, Fox and the precious sable, luxurious pelts that European nobility prized above almost all other goods. Walrus ivory came from the Arctic, harvested from walrus hunted in dangerous northern waters. This ivory was valued nearly as highly as elephant ivory and was carved into religious objects, chess pieces, and ornaments for the wealthy. Amber, fossilized tree resin found along Baltic shores, was gathered and traded southward, prized for its beauty and its supposed magical properties. The North also exported more prosaic but equally valuable goods. Dried and salted fish, primarily cod and herring, fed communities across Europe. Timber from Scandinavia's vast forests supplied shipbuilding yards and construction projects in regions where trees were scarce. Rope made from whale hide was extraordinarily strong and resistant to rot. Wool and woolen cloth, falcons for hunting, and slaves captured in raids or warfare. All these flowed south from Scandinavia. In return, the Vikings imported silver, which they used not as coined money but by weight, cutting it into pieces as needed for transactions. Fine cloth, especially silk from the East, was highly prized. Wine from Francia was a luxury good that wealthy Norse families displayed as status symbols. Glass beads and vessels, metalwork from the continent, weapons forged by master smiths using techniques not yet mastered in the north. All these traveled north in Viking holds. The trade routes were extensive. To the west, Vikings traded with Ireland and England, sometimes peacefully at established markets, sometimes through raids that blurred the line between trade and theft. To the south, they traveled down the French coast and into the Mediterranean, reaching as far as North Africa. To the east, they penetrated deep into what is now Russia, sailing up rivers and portaging between waterways, eventually reaching the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphate. These eastern routes were particularly remarkable. Swedish Vikings, the Rus, from whom Russia takes its name, established trading posts along the Volga and Dnieper rivers. They founded cities that would grow into major centers, Novgorod, Kiev, and others. They served as mercenaries in the Byzantine emperor's Varangian Guard. They traded directly with Arab merchants, exchanging northern goods for silver dirhams that have been found in hoards throughout Scandinavia. The scale of this trade was enormous. Tens of thousands of Arab silver coins have been discovered in Scandinavia, evidence of extensive trade contacts. These coins were often melted down and made into arm rings, neck rings, and other jewelry, wearable wealth that could be displayed as status symbols and easily converted back into trade goods when needed. Trading voyages followed rhythms dictated by season and weather. Spring departures took advantage of lengthening days and, hopefully, improving weather. Summer was the prime sailing season when winds were most predictable and storms less frequent. Autumn voyages carried the urgency of returning home before winter closed the sea, before ice began to form in northern waters and storms became too dangerous to risk. Many traders would overwinter far from home, waiting out the dangerous winter months in foreign ports. These seasonal communities of Norse merchants became semi-permanent presences in many cities. They established their own neighborhoods, built their own halls, maintained their own customs while also learning local languages and practices. Some married local women, established families, became permanent residents. Over generations, these settlements evolved into integrated communities that blended Norse and local cultures. The trading centers themselves were remarkable places, cosmopolitan hubs where languages, goods, and ideas mixed freely. At Hedeby, in what is now northern Germany, Vikings traded with Franks, Slavs, and merchants who had traveled from even more distant lands. At Birka in Sweden, goods from across the known world changed hands. Glass from the Rhine, silks from China, silver from Arabia, furs from Siberia. These were places where different worlds touched, where the known and the exotic mingled. The merchants themselves were often men of considerable sophistication. They needed to speak multiple languages, understand different systems of weights and measures, recognize quality in unfamiliar goods, and negotiate across cultural divides. Many were literate. Runestones erected by merchants commemorate trade voyages and partners who died far from home. They needed mathematical skill to calculate profits and losses, assess exchange rates between different currencies, and plan complex ventures that might span multiple years and thousands of miles. Trust was the foundation of long-distance trade. A merchant needed to trust that goods delivered in spring would be paid for in autumn, that partners in distant ports would honor agreements, that reputation for fair dealing would be maintained. The Vikings developed systems of credit and partnership that allowed trade to function across vast distances and cultural differences. A man's word, his oath, carried weight that no written contract could match in an age when most people couldn't read. The ships that carried this trade were slightly different from the warships that raided and explored. Trading vessels, called nars, were broader and deeper, designed to carry cargo rather than warriors. They had less freeboard, didn't need as many oars, and relied more on sail power. They sacrificed speed and maneuverability for capacity, able to carry tons of goods where a warship might carry dozens of armed men. Yet even trading voyages carried danger. Pirates existed in every era, and a merchantman heavy with valuable cargo was a tempting target. Most trading ships carried some armed men, and merchant crews needed to be capable of defending themselves if necessary. The line between merchant and warrior was never absolute in Viking culture. Most men were both, capable of trade in peaceful times and violence when circumstances required it. The women who stayed and the women who sailed. When we speak of Vikings and their voyages, we often focus on men. The sailors, warriors, explorers, and traders who sailed away from home. But behind every voyage stood women whose contributions were equally essential, whose labor made those journeys possible. The Viking household was the foundation of Norse society, and women held significant authority within it. While men might be gone for months or even years on trading voyages or raids, someone needed to manage farms, supervise thralls, make decisions about planting and harvest, settle disputes, and maintain the household standing in the community. These responsibilities fell to women. A farmer's wife was not merely a homemaker in the modern sense. She held keys to the household storerooms, symbolizing her authority over the family's wealth. She managed servants and slaves. She supervised the production of cloth, one of the most time-consuming and valuable activities of the Viking Age. She made decisions about livestock, which animals to slaughter, which to breed, which to trade. In her husband's absence, she spoke for the family at local assemblies and could even initiate legal actions. The textile production that women supervised and participated in was crucial to Viking society and economy. Every step was labor-intensive: shearing sheep, cleaning and carding wool, spinning it into thread, weaving thread into cloth, and sometimes dyeing the finished product. A single garment might represent hundreds of hours of work by multiple women. The sails for ships, those enormous woolen panels that caught the wind and drove vessels across oceans, were products of women's labor, taking months or even a year to complete. This work was social as well as productive. Women would gather to spin and weave, together sharing labor, songs, stories, and gossip. These gatherings were important social networks where information was exchanged, reputations were built or destroyed, and community bonds were strengthened. The parallel with men's gatherings in mead halls was deliberate. Both were spaces where the community came together, where culture was transmitted, where social order was maintained. Some women traveled with the men. Archaeological evidence shows that women participated in the settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and other colonized territories. The DNA of modern Icelanders reveals ancestry from both Scandinavian men and women, and also from Irish and Scottish women who were brought to Iceland as wives or slaves. These women crossed the North Atlantic in open boats, endured the hardships of sea voyages and frontier settlements, and built new societies in harsh lands. Women's graves in Iceland and Greenland contain items that speak to their status and activities. Keys denoting household authority, weaving tools, jewelry, and sometimes items that suggest wealth and high status. Glass beads from distant lands, silver arm rings, fine imported cloth. These women were not mere appendages to male colonizers, but active participants in the Viking expansion, bringing with them the skills and knowledge necessary to establish households and communities in new lands. There are also tantalizing hints of women who sailed for reasons beyond settlement. The sagas mention shield maidens, women warriors who fought alongside men. While scholars debate how common this actually was, archaeological discoveries have confirmed that some women were buried with weapons, and at least one famous grave in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to be a male warrior's burial, has been proven through DNA analysis to contain a woman buried with a full set of weapons and military equipment. Whether this woman was an actual warrior, a leader who commanded others, or someone buried with symbolic weapons for other reasons remains debated. But the possibility that some women took active military roles challenges simplistic views of gender in Viking society. Norse culture clearly recognized that women could embody qualities of courage and leadership, that the boundaries between male and female roles were not as rigid as we might assume. The goddesses of Norse mythology reflected this complexity. Freya was both a goddess of love and fertility, and a goddess of war, who claimed half of all slain warriors. The Valkyries, Odin's shield maidens, were female warriors who chose who would die in battle. Even in domestic spheres, goddesses like Frigg possessed knowledge and power that rivaled Odin's, and the Norns who wove fate were female, their decisions binding even upon gods. This mythological framework gave cultural space for women to exercise various forms of power and authority. A woman who managed a large household, who supervised numerous workers, who made decisions affecting her family's prosperity and standing, such a woman was fulfilling a role recognized as important and powerful within Norse culture. She wasn't merely keeping house while men did the real work. She was exercising a form of authority that was understood as essential to social functioning. The women who waited on shore for returning ships carried their own burdens. The uncertainty of not knowing if husbands, sons, fathers, brothers would return was a constant companion. Months might pass without news. A ship might be lost without anyone ever knowing what happened, swallowed by a storm, wrecked on unknown shores, crew killed by pirates or illness or accident. The silence of absence, stretching from weeks to months to years, must have been its own form of torture. Yet women endured. They managed households through their husband's absence. They raised children alone for months or years at a time. They maintained farms and businesses. They upheld their family's reputation, and when ships did return, when those familiar sails appeared on the horizon, when longships beached and men came home bearing trade goods or plunder, the joy must have been overwhelming, tinged with relief and gratitude to whatever gods had brought them safely home. Thafaga of the Westfarers. Let us now turn our attention to one of history's most remarkable journeys, the Viking discovery and settlement of Iceland, Greenland, and eventually North America itself. This was no sudden conquest, no single dramatic voyage, but rather a gradual pushing westward across the North Atlantic, driven by necessity, curiosity, and the restless Viking spirit that could never quite settle for what was already known. In the late 9th century, as political consolidation in Norway made life difficult for certain chieftains who valued their independence, many Norse families began to look westward for new opportunities. King Harald Fairhair was unifying Norway under his rule, and many powerful families who had previously governed their own territories found themselves facing a choice: submit to Harald's authority or leave. For proud men accustomed to independence, submission was bitter medicine. The sea offered an alternative. They had heard tales of islands to the west, lands glimpsed by ships blown off course, rumors carried by traders and explorers. The sea, ever mysterious, was revealing new possibilities. Irish monks had sailed to Iceland earlier, establishing small hermitages where they could pray in solitude, far from the distractions of the world. But beginning around 874 CE, Norwegian families began arriving in significant numbers, bringing their language, laws, and gods to this island of fire and ice. The settlement of Iceland is remarkably well documented in medieval sources. The Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, records the names of approximately 400 primary settlers and describes which parts of Iceland they claimed. This was not random colonization, but a deliberate process where settlers claimed large territories, marked their boundaries, and established farms that their descendants would occupy for generations. The first permanent settler was reputedly Ingolfur Arnarsson, who arrived around 874 CE. As he approached Iceland, he threw his high seat pillars overboard, ornately carved post from his home in Norway that symbolized his authority, and vowed to settle wherever the gods caused them to wash ashore. When he found them 3 years later in a bay on the southwestern coast, he established his farm there. The settlement grew into Reykjavik, Iceland's capital city, which sits on that same spot today. Life in Iceland was hard but free. The landscape was unlike anything in Norway, a land of volcanoes and geysers, of hot springs and glaciers, of long, dark winters and summers when the sun barely set. Trees were sparse, wood had to be imported or salvaged from driftwood that washed ashore. But there was good grazing in the valleys, fish, abundant in the seas, and most importantly, freedom from kings and their demands. The settlers created the Althing around 930 CE, one of the world's oldest surviving parliaments. Each summer, free men would gather at Thingvellir, the Parliament Plains, where Iceland's main geological rift creates a dramatic natural amphitheater. Here they would hear legal cases, make laws, celebrate marriages, and transact business. For 2 weeks each summer, Iceland's scattered population came together, transforming Thingvellir from empty plains into a bustling temporary city of tents and booths. The Althing had no executive power, no king, no police force. It could make judgments and pronounce outlawry, exile, on those who violated its rulings, but enforcement depended on the community's willingness to uphold its decisions. This was a society built on reputation and honor, where a man's word was his bond and breaking an oath could destroy not just the individual, but his entire family's standing. In this new land, away from the kings and established hierarchies of Norway, they built a society according to their own values, a society where a man's worth was measured by his reputation, his wisdom, and his willingness to stand by his word. Iceland became a laboratory for Norse culture, developing in isolation from European influences, preserving Old Norse language and stories that would later be written down as the Great Icelandic Sagas, our primary sources for understanding Viking Age culture. But even Iceland eventually grew crowded, at least by Viking standards. By the late 10th century, the best land had all been claimed, and younger sons seeking to establish their own farms had fewer options. Some men possessed that particular restlessness that no settlement could satisfy, that yearning for what lay beyond the next horizon. Among these was Eric the Red, a man whose temperament matched his name, fiery, stubborn, and prone to conflicts that repeatedly forced him to seek new beginnings. Eric Thorvaldsen, called Eric the Red for his red hair and beard and perhaps also for his temper, was born in Norway but came to Iceland with his father, who had been exiled for manslaughter. Like father, like son, Eric too became involved in killings and was outlawed from Iceland around 982 CE for a term of 3 years. Exile was a serious punishment in Norse society, cutting a man off from his land, his community, his support networks. But for Eric, it became an opportunity. He had heard tales of land to the west. 50 years earlier, a sailor named Gunnbjörn had been blown off course and glimpsed unknown coasts. Eric decided to investigate. He sailed west into waters that were more legend than geography, following rumors and intuition across hundreds of miles of open ocean. He found a land massive and forbidding, a place of towering glaciers and frozen coasts. Most of Greenland's shoreline offered no possibility of settlement, just ice and barren rock. But along the southwestern shore, where the warm Irminger current flows, Eric discovered fjords where grass grew green in the short summer, where sheep could graze and settlements might survive. For 3 years, his term of exile, Eric explored Greenland's southwestern coast. He mapped fjords, noted resources, found the best locations for farms. Whether from optimism or marketing genius, he named this harsh land Greenland, a name that would attract other colonists seeking fresh starts. The name wasn't entirely deceptive. The areas where settlement was possible were indeed green in summer, with grass-covered valleys that reminded Icelanders of home. Eric returned to Iceland with tales of opportunity. Greenland, he said, had vast unclaimed lands, abundant grazing, no existing population to conflict with. For younger sons in Iceland struggling to establish themselves, for families that had fallen on hard times, for anyone seeking a fresh start, Greenland offered possibility. In 985 CE, Eric led a fleet of 25 ships toward Greenland. The voyage was difficult, storms scattered the fleet, and only 14 ships completed the journey. But those ships carried several hundred colonists, men, women, children, livestock, tools, seeds, everything needed to establish a new society. The settlers created 2 main settlement areas, the Eastern Settlement, ironically on the southwestern coast, and the Western Settlement, further north. They built farms using stone and turf, developing a distinctive Greenlandic architectural style adapted to limited resources and harsh climate. They raised cattle, sheep, and goats. They hunted seal and caribou. They gathered birds' eggs from cliff colonies. They traded walrus ivory and polar bear skins back to Europe, luxury goods that could be exchanged for timber, iron, and other necessities that Greenland lacked. The Greenland settlements endured for nearly 500 years, a remarkable achievement in one of Earth's most challenging environments. At their peak, they supported perhaps 2,500 to 5,000 people living in several hundred farms. They built churches once they converted to Christianity around 1000 CE. They maintained their Norse identity and connections to Iceland and Norway. They developed specialized hunting techniques for Arctic conditions. They traded across vast distances, their ivory appearing in European markets, their merchants traveling to Bergen and beyond. Yet always, they lived on the edge. The growing season was desperately short, perhaps 3 months when grass could grow and livestock graze. Hay production was crucial. If a farm couldn't harvest enough hay to feed livestock through the 9-month winter, animals would starve and the farm might fail. They were dependent on supply ships from Iceland bringing timber for building and ship repair, iron for tools and weapons, grain that wouldn't grow in Greenland's climate. When these supply chains faltered, when Iceland faced its own difficulties, when European demand for walrus ivory declined as African elephant ivory became more available, when climate change made the North Atlantic crossing more difficult, Greenland's settlements became increasingly vulnerable. But this decline lay centuries in the future. For now, in the late 10th century, Greenland represented success, proof that Norse determination could carve out a living even in the most hostile environments. Vinland, the edge of legend. But the westward journeys didn't end with Greenland. Around the year 1000 CE, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, sailed even further into the unknown, following reports from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who claimed to have seen unknown lands to the west while blown off course years earlier. Bjarni's story must have tantalized the Greenlanders. He'd been sailing from Iceland to Greenland when storms drove him south and west of his intended route. When the weather cleared, he found himself within sight of land. It was neither Greenland nor Iceland. Trees grew on low, forested hills, a remarkable sight to people who lived in lands where trees were rare or absent. Bjarni didn't land but turned north, eventually finding his way to Greenland and telling his strange tale. For years, this story circulated among the Greenlanders. Bjarni was criticized for his lack of curiosity. Why hadn't he investigated these unknown lands? What opportunities might exist there? What resources might be gathered? Leif Erikson decided to find out. Around the year 1000 CE, he purchased Bjarni's ship, which had proven itself capable of the journey, recruited a crew of 35 men, and sailed south and west in search of the lands Bjarni had glimpsed. What Leif discovered changed everything, though the Vikings themselves didn't quite realize it at the time. He found lands of forests and meadows, rivers teeming with salmon, and vines bearing grapes, or so the sagas tell us. Moving south along the coast, he identified 3 distinct regions, giving each a descriptive name. Helluland, Stone Slab Land, was likely Baffin Island, a place of barren rock and glaciers offering little of value. Markland, Forest Land, was probably Labrador, heavily forested and promising for timber, but not immediately suitable for settlement. And finally, Vinland, Wineland, or perhaps Meadowland, which might have been Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, or even further south. The exact location remains debated, but the general area is clear. Leif Erikson had reached North America. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as legend, exaggeration, or misidentification. The sagas are literary works, written down 2 centuries after the events they describe, mixing history with fiction in ways modern historians find frustrating. How could Vikings have reached America? Where was the evidence? Without physical proof, skepticism seemed justified, but in 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, made a discovery that vindicated the sagas. At Lonso Meadows in northern Newfoundland, they found the remains of a Norse settlement, Viking buildings, Norse artifacts, evidence of iron smelting using bog iron in the Norse manner. Here was physical proof, undeniable and overwhelming. The Vikings had indeed reached North America 500 years before Columbus, establishing at least temporary settlements on these distant shores. Imagine the wonder of those first Vikings stepping onto North American soil. They were further from home than any Norse people had ever ventured, standing on a continent whose vastness they couldn't begin to comprehend. The forests must have seemed endless after the treeless landscapes of Iceland and Greenland, timber so abundant that they could be wasteful with it, using massive logs for buildings where in Greenland every stick of wood was precious. The native peoples they encountered, whom they called Skraelings, meaning wretches or screechers, probably referring to the way their language sounded to Norse ears, were unlike anyone they had known. These were the ancestors of modern First Nations peoples, with their own sophisticated cultures, their own technologies, their own understandings of this land they had inhabited for thousands of years. The sagas tell us that initial contacts were tentative, curious on both sides. The Norse had trade goods, metal tools, red cloth, other items the natives had never seen. The natives had furs and other local products. Trade seemed possible, but mutual incomprehension bred fear and suspicion. Cultural misunderstandings escalated. Violence broke out. The sagas describe battles between Norse settlers and Skraelings. The natives' numbers and the Vikings' distance from reinforcements made sustained settlement impossible. One saga tells of a terrifying battle where the Skraelings used a weapon the Norse had never encountered, something launched from a pole that made a terrible noise and caused panic among the Norse warriors. Was this some kind of sling, a catapult, or something else entirely? The description is frustratingly vague. What's clear is that the Norse were outnumbered and vulnerable. They had crossed an ocean to reach Vinland, but they couldn't establish supply lines, couldn't send for reinforcements, couldn't create the support network necessary for permanent settlement. A few years of attempting to settle, perhaps a decade at most, and they abandoned Vinland, returning to Greenland with tales of a rich land that nonetheless could not be held. They didn't stop trying immediately. The sagas mention multiple expeditions to Vinland over the following years, attempts to harvest timber, to trade with the Skraelings, to establish some kind of presence. One expedition was led by a woman, Freydis Erik's daughter of Erik the Red, and sister to Leif Erikson. Her saga includes tales of her fierce courage and also of treachery and violence among the settlers themselves. Vinland, it seemed, brought out both the best and worst in those who ventured there. Gradually, the voyages became less frequent. The benefits didn't justify the risks. Greenland remained connected to Europe, but Vinland faded from practical consideration into the realm of saga and story. The knowledge that land existed to the west persisted, but the motivation to colonize it didn't. The Vikings had discovered America, but they didn't conquer it, didn't change it, didn't leave a permanent mark beyond those few remains at L'Anse aux Meadows that archaeologists would eventually find 1,000 years later. Yet, the achievement remains staggering. With nothing but their longships, their knowledge of sea and sky, and their extraordinary courage, the Vikings crossed the North Atlantic and discovered a new world. They proved that the ocean, vast as it was, could not contain the human hunger for knowledge, for new horizons, for the next adventure, waiting just beyond the visible edge of things. I'm curious what you think about this moment in history, dear listener. The Vikings reached America, but didn't stay, didn't colonize, didn't transform the continent as later European arrivals would. Was this a failure, or does it represent a different kind of success? The achievement of reaching across an ocean without the subsequent destructive colonization that came 5 centuries later. Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Rus, sailing the rivers eastward. While some Vikings sailed west across the Atlantic, others turned east, following rivers deep into what is now Russia and Ukraine. These Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus, from an Old Norse word possibly meaning rowers, created a different kind of expansion, one based on trade and strategic settlement along waterways that connected the Baltic Sea to the Byzantine Empire and the Arab Caliphate. The rivers of Eastern Europe offered a highway system that could be exploited by people who understood boats. From the Baltic, Vikings could sail up the Neva River to Lake Ladoga, then portage to the Volkhov River and Lake Ilmen. From there, multiple river systems led south, the Volga toward the Caspian Sea and the Arab lands, the Dnieper toward the Black Sea and Byzantium. Portaging, carrying boats and cargo overland between waterways, was backbreaking labor, but made possible by the longship's design. These vessels, though large enough to carry substantial cargo and crew, were light enough to be dragged or carried when necessary. The Rus developed specialized techniques and equipment for portaging, and the routes they established became well-trodden pathways that connected northern and southern Europe. Along these routes, the Rus established trading posts that grew into cities. Staraya Ladoga, founded in the mid-8th century, became the first capital of what would later become Russia. Novgorod grew into a major center. Kiev, established on the Dnieper River, became the most important city of the region, capital of Kievan Rus, a state that was as much Slavic as Scandinavian, a fusion culture that drew from multiple traditions.